Joining us now is Johnny Smith. Johnny is a historian of 20th century United States history, especially race, sports, and popular culture. He is also the undergraduate advisor for the Sports Society and Technology. Did I get? Yes, Sports Society and Technology program. Although, Johnny, it doesn't say here where that SST program is. His newest, maybe you'll tell us in a second, his newest book is Blood Brothers, The Fatal Friendship Between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. Johnny, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm in Atlanta. I teach at Georgia Tech, so that Sports Society and Technology program was an initiative in our liberal arts college that brings together different disciplines, history, sociology, economics, where we study sports and our students have the opportunity to look at sports in a more critical way in our classes.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And I guess the technology includes what, media, communication technology, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what we learn more and more is a lot of our students have expressed an interest in sports analytics and how big data and computer science is changing the way that sports organizations and also marketing companies looking at consumer habits, how that all influences our modern sports culture. So it's interesting to hear from the students what their interests are and what they pay attention to in our culture.
Yeah, it really is, including the whole, I mean, whether it's the Moneyball side of it or whether it's the Nate Silver side of it and how sports can turn people into statisticians, basically, or, I mean, there are a million ways that can go. So it's a great and it's an interesting topic. And speaking of interesting topics, Johnny, when I saw your book on the friendship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, it was one of those things where I thought, what a great idea. Why hasn't somebody done it before? It feels like it was sitting out there in the zeitgeist waiting to be, plucked or something. I don't know if you know what I mean, but how did you get this idea?
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point. I think one of the challenges in writing the book, and maybe one of the reasons it was not written by another historian before, is that for a period of time, Cassius Clay and Malcolm X had a clandestine relationship, and much of their interaction took place in private. And so that poses some challenges for biographers and historians. And so one of the things that my co-author, Randy Roberts, and I did is we had to really get creative in terms of the kinds of sources we used to trace the movements of Cassius Clay, as he was then known, and Malcolm X. So one of the things that we did is we created a lengthy timeline, day by day, following the movement of Clay and Malcolm from 1962. They met in June of that year, all the way through 1965 when Malcolm X was assassinated. Malcolm was a prime target of the FBI. And so that was a key way of looking at what Malcolm was doing and some of the meetings that were taking place. And we looked at other key sources as well, State Department records for when Malcolm and Ali traveled abroad to the Middle East and Africa. And of course, all sorts of publications, newspapers, magazines, oral histories, transcripts, interviews we did ourselves.
I picture you guys with one of those like giant maps and push pins kind of tracking these guys around North America. Also, by the way, you obviously relied a lot on primary sources. You talked to people who were there, people who were in the Nation of Islam at the time, and associates. Was it a challenge at all being two white guys writing about this very African American historical experience?
Well, I think that's an important question. I think what Randy and I bring to the table is that we are professional historians. We have studied African American history, the civil rights movement, and we interact with historians who have studied that topic in depth. And so I think what we try to bring to the table is an objectivity. Historians are trained to bring an objectivity to the subject, but I think that also requires that you bring a certain sensitivity to something as complicated and delicate as race in America. And I think one of the things that we sought to do in this book is to understand the role of race in America in the 1960s through the lives of Cassius Clay and Malcolm X. And so I think in leaning on our professional training, it helped us. But is it possible that if an African American historian wrote the book, that he or she would see things differently? It's possible. But it's also probably more likely that it's a case of that historians interpret the past based on the evidence that they have. And so it's really important that any historian, any biographer who writes about such iconic figures, that they follow the sources and they use those sources to recreate the past, to reconstruct the past, and interpret the evidence that they have before them.
Yeah, fair answer. Absolutely fair answer. And as we, for those of us who might not have been around at that time or might not remember it well now, I mean, today, Muhammad Ali is a beloved figure by most people, I say, in this country. Malcolm X is respected, but if we highly respected. But if we go back, kind of take the Wayback Machine to 1962, 1963, 1964, I think that a lot of America, especially white America, had, but Black America too, I think may have had a very different view of these two men. Is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. Let's start with Cassius Clay and how he was viewed at that time. When he met Malcolm X in 1962, he was at the bottom of the top 10 contenders in the heavyweight division. So he was not really considered to be someone who was on the cusp of contending for the heavyweight title.
So in 1962, Cassius Clay is a top 10 contender, but he's at the bottom of the top 10. And most reporters dismiss him. They don't look at him as someone who is a serious challenger for the heavyweight title, not someone who's ever going to beat Floyd Patterson or Sonny Liston. But gradually, Cassius Clay reveals the political side of himself that he had not divulged before this. Previously, Cassius Clay had said all the right things, that the right people were taking care of the civil rights problem, that he believed that he was an integrationist and so on. But in 1963, he starts to say things like, I don't believe in integration. I don't believe in civil rights marches. It's dangerous. I think that we should stay with our own people, our own side of the neighborhood. And so this makes a lot of folks in the civil rights struggle question Cassius Clay. And reporters don't know where this is coming from. But when he says in 1963 that the NAACP is ignorant, now suddenly he has become a target. He is someone that is polarizing the country, not just because of his outrageous performances predicting who he's going to beat in what round, but because he's essentially positioning himself as in opposition to the integrationist movement. Now, where's this coming from? It's coming from the fact that he is going to secret meetings in the mosques of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was a black nationalist organization led by a minister named Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad declared that he was the supreme minister in the nation and Allah's messenger, God's messenger. And Elijah Muhammad's point man was Malcolm X, who was even more famous than Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm X at that time, someone who said that white people were devils, he was considered the most hated black man in America.
He said
attacked Martin Luther King in the press.
Right, he's attacked Martin Luther King. He's called. He repeats the notion that the white man is the devil. He when John F. Kennedy is assassinated, famously, and also recounted in your book, says as an old country boy, he recognizes when chickens come home to roost, the chickens are coming home to roost. That doesn't bother him, he says, or words to that effect. So widely despised, widely hated. So, and as you point out in your book, Cassius Clay, basically up to this point, rockets to fame at 21, 22 years old, and is kind of a clown, if anything, for the media. He plays around, he clowns around. I'm going to beat him. He tells little poems. He does all that, makes faces for the camera. All of a sudden, he's an intense political figure, right?
That's right. And I think what's important in understanding who Cassius Clay was at that moment is that the clowning, this mask that Randy and I talk about in the book, that's a way to protect himself. It's protecting his career because he knows that if the press knows, if the boxing promoters know that he has a relationship with Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, it would derail his career. It would undermine his chances for ever becoming the heavyweight champion of the world. But what's going to happen is, after he does win the title in 1964 against Sonny Liston, that's when he decides that I'm going to be who I want to be. And he says to the press the day after he wins the title, I'm free to be who I want to be. I don't have to be who you want me to be. And when he says that, he's essentially rejecting the political boundaries of sports that said you show up, you perform, you say the right things, and especially for black men, you don't talk about racism in America. You don't express your political opinions. And that's the influence of Malcolm X on Cassius Clay. Malcolm had been encouraging him to use the heavyweight title as a platform to address race in America, to be a voice for black nationalism in America.
Now, one of the many things I learned from your book, Johnny Smith, that I didn't know was that, according to your investigations, somehow Malcolm X believed that Clay was going to win at a time when virtually all the sports writers in America thought that Sonny Liston was going to send him to the hospital. They were basically, prepared to wait at the hospital for Cassius Clay to show up. They thought he would be hospitalized, much less not win. And the senior leadership, the other senior leadership of the Nation of Islam, thought he was wasting his time because Cassius Clay wasn't going to win, but Malcolm X, he thought this was God's plan or something. He thought that, what was the deal there? He had faith in Cassius Clay, didn't he?
He did. He saw that there was something special about Cassius that he had not seen in anyone else. There was a charisma, there was a confidence, a boldness, certainly someone who embodied racial pride, and I think that in some ways, Malcolm saw parts of himself in Cassius Clay. And I think in his faith, in Malcolm's faith, he believed that Allah had declared that Cassius Clay would win. Now, whether or not Malcolm at his core believed this, whether or not he had no doubts at all, we'll never know. But this is what he tells Cassius on the eve of the fight, that Allah would not have taken Cassius this far to let him lose. And so there was something very important there, because there were no other prominent figures in the Nation of Islam in Clay's camp on the eve of the fight in Miami in February of 1964. It was Malcolm. Now, there were a few other members of the Nation of Islam who were there that were friends of Cassius Clay's. But this was important. It helped cement the bond between Malcolm and Clay, because Clay could see that Malcolm had confidence in him, and Clay admired Malcolm, and so that helped build him up.
And, a lot of times a story is told not only through these broader themes like the one you just described, Johnny Smith, and the book is Blood Brothers, the fatal friendship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, but also in some of the little vignettes. And one of the vignettes that struck me was the appearance of Sam Cooke at ringside, the great singer, rhythm and blues singer. They say that when Sam Cooke was shot, he was shot at a motel in Los Angeles. I believe it was Los Angeles, that a copy of Malcolm X's autobiography was on the seat of his sports car. But so there's a intriguing what if question about Sam Cooke. There's also a little scene in your book where, and I forget where it happens in the sequence, but where Cassius Clay is fascinated by the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Where'd you get that?
That came from the work of George Plimpton. Plimpton had an opportunity to go to Miami. He was writing for Harper's Magazine, and he got an interview with Malcolm. And the thing that was interesting is two things at that time. One is Plimpton is a white writer,
right,
surrounded by all the black folks in Cassius Clay's camp. And Cassius loved movies. He loved stories, tall tales, and he was really fascinated by UFOs. And so he flipped the switch. They put on the movie. And so Plimpton watches Clay, and Clay is fascinated by this. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that Plimpton secures an interview with Malcolm. And at that time, Malcolm X was suspended by Elijah Muhammad for his comments about President Kennedy. And so Elijah was testing Malcolm. He said, okay, for 90 days you will not preach, you will not have any association with any of the members of the Nation of Islam, they will not associate with you, and you cannot talk to the press. Well, trying to silence Malcolm, that was not going to be possible. But Malcolm talks to Plimpton, and he tells him what he believes about Cassius, their relationship, what he believes Clay is capable of in becoming a true black champion. So in Malcolm's mind, that meant being a champion for black people, and so that would mean rejecting integration and believing in black independence and separatism and so on. And so the point is, though, when Malcolm talked to George Plimpton, he was in clear violation of this edict from Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm could not be restrained. He was moving in a direction outside of the Nation of Islam, and he wanted to take Cassius Clay with him. The question was, would Cassius Clay decide in the end here, when this feud is going on between Elijah and Malcolm, where would he go? And we talk about that decision in the book.
You know, that relationship and that relationship between Malcolm and the Nation of Islam and Malcolm and Muhammad Ali, to me, it feels Shakespearean, especially the relationship between the two men. The part for me that was hardest to read because of the enormous respect I have for both these figures is the part where, okay, you know, just flashing forward, Malcolm X has a break with the Nation of Islam. He travels to Mecca. He becomes a traditional Muslim. Which means embracing, you know, that all men can be brothers, are spiritually brothers, and so on if they embrace the same path. And still radical, still transformative in his vision, but inseparably broken with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. And Muhammad Ali goes with the Nation of Islam and against this man that was like his brother. Painful to read. And any thoughts or reflections on that rupture and the long-term price it might have taken on Muhammad Ali? Because, of course, shortly thereafter, Malcolm X dies.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a good point. I think readers would be surprised, as you indicated, that when they break, Ali becomes very vindictive, vengeful, and he criticizes Malcolm in the press as a traitor, as a hypocrite. And basically, when he used the word hypocrite, this was a very specific term used in the Nation of Islam. A hypocrite was someone who basically was never a true believer in Allah. And Malcolm was never a true believer in Elijah Muhammad, who was supposed to be the prophet of Allah. And so Ali joins the chorus of members in the Nation of Islam who follow Elijah Muhammad and condemn Malcolm as the number one enemy of the Nation of Islam. All right, well, why? Why does this happen? To get to the point, Malcolm X discovered that Elijah Muhammad was having extramarital affairs with his secretaries and had a number of children out of wedlock. And this created a whole crisis of faith for Malcolm. And so he shared these secrets with the press in the summer of 1964. And so now, essentially, he's declared war on the Nation of Islam, and his life is in danger. And so this offends Muhammad Ali, because Muhammad Ali looks at Elijah Muhammad as a divine figure, divine authority. And so I think what's been forgotten about Muhammad Ali is just how violent his rhetoric was toward Malcolm. He said something to the effect that Malcolm deserved what he got. You know, we've seen Will Smith's character playing Muhammad Ali in Michael Mann's biopic, where Will Smith pulls over to the side of the road hearing about Malcolm X's assassination. He's crying. The tears are coming down his face. I doubt that happened. Now, I don't doubt that Ali was saddened by the murder, but he never publicly, at that time in 1965, acknowledged a sadness. He didn't want to talk about Malcolm. He was more interested in saying that that the Nation of Islam was not responsible, that they are a peaceful group of people, and there was no way they were involved with Malcolm X's murder, which was not true.
All right. So, final question. I guess I would ask you, did Muhammad Ali ever come to regret that decision that we know about?
I think he did, because I think in time, in the late 60s and in the early 70s, he recognized that the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, had control over his life, that you could not disobey Elijah Muhammad, because if you did, as Malcolm did, there were serious consequences. Ali had heard the stories from Malcolm himself about the corporal punishment used inside the nation to keep men in line. And so in the 70s, Ali revealed to some reporters that, you know, he couldn't leave the Nation of Islam even if he wanted to, because he was afraid of what they might do to him. And so it's not until 1975, after Elijah Muhammad dies, that I think that fear goes away for Ali, because Elijah's son Wallace takes over the nation and moves the Nation of Islam into Sunni Islam, where they embrace the universal message. And so I think at that point, Ali was able to express some relief, where the fear dissolved. But I think he knew in that period, from the time that Malcolm was killed until Elijah Muhammad died, that he had to toe the line and he had to obey. And that's a key part in understanding who Muhammad Ali was during that decade. It was someone who was completely loyal to the wishes of Elijah Muhammad.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but there's a lot more in the book. I encourage people to read it. The book is Blood Brothers, The Fatal Friendship Between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. Johnny Smith, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.